The sands of Egypt have always carried whispers. In their shifting grains lie both the memory of gods and the frailty of men, for no throne is eternal and no dynasty unbreakable. In the late 14th century before Christ, those whispers grew louder, echoing through temples that had fallen silent, through palaces abandoned, through sanctuaries where the light of a single god had burned too brightly and consumed the balance of the world. The age of Akhenaten, the heretic king, had fractured Egypt's soul. And in the wake of his revolution, a boy king named Tutankhamun had briefly restored familiar names and rituals. But he had died before reaching his prime. The old courtier Ay had seized the throne next, ruling briefly like a man clutching a fading flame. When he too vanished into death, Egypt stood trembling on the edge of collapse. The great kingdom that had stretched its banners from Nubia to the Levant was broken, not by invasion, but by uncertainty, by betrayal, and by the weakness of dynasties that could no longer command trust. It was in this vacuum that a soldier watched, waited, and sharpened the tools of ambition. His name was Horemheb. He was not born a king, nor raised within the perfumed chambers of royal palaces. He had grown in dust, hardened in military camps, and carved his reputation with the edge of a sword. He belonged not to the divine line of pharaohs, but to the restless body of Egypt's army, the men who fought, bled, and died, while gods were debated and monuments toppled. He was an outsider, yet an outsider poised to step into the sacred office of kingship. But no man becomes pharaoh by will alone. Egypt was not only a land of soldiers and scribes, but of queens whose bloodlines could weave legitimacy where ambition could not. For Horemheb, that figure was Mutnedjmet. She was no ordinary consort. She carried in her veins a thread of royal blood, perhaps the sister or near kin of the famous Nefertiti. Her very name tied her to the lineage of Amarna, the family that had once torn Egypt apart. And yet it was precisely that blood which could heal Egypt's fractured identity. When Horemheb bound his life to Mutnedjmet, he forged not only a marriage but a bridge between old chaos and new order. She was the silent key to his ascent, the one whose presence gave shape to his dream of power. To understand the world they entered is to step into a twilight kingdom. Imagine Thebes after the reign of Akhenaten, temples desecrated, the mighty god Amun eclipsed by a Ten's blazing sun disk, only to be resurrected by priests desperate to restore balance. Imagine cities filled with suspicion, where officials lined their pockets with bribes while peasants starved under the weight of taxes. Imagine a dynasty that once marched confidently into Asia now reduced to uncertainty, its kings dying too young or too old, its succession fragile as papyrus under flame. This was the Egypt Horemheb inherited, not through blood, but through ambition, not through divine descent, but through relentless service. From the beginning, his rise was marked by paradox. He was the general who fought in the shadows, carrying the young Tutankhamun's standards on campaigns to Nubia and Syria, ensuring that Egypt's enemies did not smell weakness. His face, carved in statues as a scribe and officer, reveals a man whose discipline was sharpened not only in war, but in administration. He embodied both soldier and bureaucrat, a man of pen and sword. And yet, even as he amassed power, he remained outside the sacred circle of royal legitimacy. That circle was what Mutnedjmet could provide. Their union was born of necessity, but also carved by fate. For a general of common birth, marrying into royal blood was both strategy and salvation. For a woman tied to the memory of Nefertiti's family, binding her life to a soldier meant survival in a court where dynasties crumbled overnight. Together they represented a convergence of two currents, his military might, her royal lineage. It was a bond that would eventually reforge Egypt's destiny, but at this early stage, it was only a whisper, a possibility carried on the hot winds of Thebes. The couple lived in a court haunted by ghosts. Tutankhamun's tomb was being filled even as Horemheb expanded his private tomb at Saqqara, a sprawling complex fit for a great general, not yet a king. In its painted chambers, Mutnedjmet would have walked alongside her husband, gazing at scenes of military triumph and order, symbols of a man preparing himself for a throne that was not yet his. Those images were not merely vanity. They were a statement of intent. Horemheb was sculpting himself into the likeness of Pharaoh long before he wore the double crown. And always Mutnedjmet's shadow lingered beside him, a quiet reminder that legitimacy was as much a matter of blood as it was of conquest. The years after Tutankhamun's death were years of waiting. Ay's rule was brief but treacherous, a desperate attempt by an old man to cling to the royal line. Horemheb, though overlooked for the throne, remained commander of the armies, the real source of Egypt's strength. Mutnedjmet's position at court tied them to continuity, even as others sat on the throne. Their marriage was a quiet but enduring alliance, like a seed waiting for the floodwaters of the Nile. Egypt itself was restless. Priests of Amun demanded restoration, scribes complained of corruption, peasants prayed for justice while their granaries emptied. Soldiers returned from campaigns with scars but little reward. The double crown weighed heavy on whoever wore it, and kings had begun to fall like stalks of papyrus in the wind. Into this turbulence, the figure of Horemheb loomed larger each year, and beside him stood Mutnedjmet, her role often invisible in official inscriptions, but undeniable in the fabric of legitimacy. Part one of their story is not triumph, but tension. It is the tale of a couple poised on the edge of history, bound together by ambition and necessity, standing in a land desperate for order. Horemheb was the sword. Mutnedjmet was the seal. Together they represented the possibility of a future where Egypt could breathe again. But that future had yet to be written, and in its shadow lay the sacrifices that would define them both. And so Egypt waited, its temples half restored, its people half hopeful, its armies restless, its gods demanding. A soldier sharpened his ambition, a queen carried the fragile thread of legitimacy, and the desert whispered of change. The age of collapse was ending, but whether the restoration would bring salvation or merely another cycle of erasure remained a question only time could answer. In the heart of Egypt's empire, when the echoes of Amarna still clung to walls like soot from an extinguished fire, a man of discipline and silence walked the line between loyalty and ambition. His name was Horemheb, commander of armies, guardian of Egypt's borders. And yet, despite the armor that gleamed in battle and the titles etched into stone, still a man outside the sacred circle of kings. To understand his rise is to understand Egypt's hunger for order, and to see how one soldier became the embodiment of the law itself. Horemheb's path began not in palaces of marble, but in the dust of barracks. Unlike Tutankhamun, whose life had been swaddled in gold, Horemheb's youth was forged in the rhythms of the military. He learned the steady patience of long marches, the precise mathematics of chariot warfare, the brutal efficiency of discipline. He studied not only the sword, but the scroll, for Egypt's generals were not mere men of violence. They were organizers, quartermasters, administrators. To command was not simply to lead men into battle, it was to feed them, pay them, discipline them, and report their deeds to the court. From the beginning, Horemheb was both soldier and scribe, wielding ink and steel with equal ease. Campaigns carried him south into Nubia, where the Nile narrowed into violent cataracts and tribes resisted Egyptian order with sudden ambushes. They carried him eastward into the Levant, where cities shifted allegiance as easily as the wind shifted sand, where the Hittites loomed as shadows pressing against Egypt's fading borders. Horemheb distinguished himself not only by victories, but by his relentless steadiness. He was no reckless warrior chasing glory. He was a soldier of discipline, the kind who saw war not as spectacle, but as necessity. Egypt, bruised by the turbulence of court politics, needed such men, men who could hold the line while kings faltered. Yet in Thebes, his destiny was not shaped by spears alone. At court, the woman who would become the anchor of his life stood in quiet grace. Mutnedjmet, linked by blood to the Amarna family, carried the silent weight of legitimacy. She was no ornament. She was a survivor of a dynasty that had burned itself in the blaze of Akhenaten's revolution. To some, her blood was tainted by heresy. To others, it was the only fragile bridge back to continuity. For Horemheb, her presence was the seal that could turn his ambition from rebellion to restoration. Their marriage was more than companionship. It was an alliance of necessity, forged in the recognition that power demanded both steel and lineage. As commander of the armies, Horemheb lived in two worlds. In one, he was the loyal servant of Tutankhamun, parading behind the boy king as inscriptions proclaimed victories in Nubia and Syria. In the other, he was the quiet architect of power, the man whose hand held the sword while kings held only symbols. Tutankhamun's reign restored Amun to his temples, but the true restoration of order belonged not to a child on the throne, but to the general who enforced his decrees. Mutnedjmet stood by him, her presence at ceremonies reminding courtiers that his household, though not born of pharaohs, now bore royal ties. The years were cruel in their irony. Tutankhamun, fragile in body, died before the strength of his reign could take root. Ay, an old courtier, stepped into the vacuum and claimed the throne. Horemheb was denied the kingship he had perhaps expected, overlooked in favor of a man who had maneuvered through decades of palace intrigue. It was a bitter moment, for Horemheb commanded the armies that could have seized the crown by force. Yet he did not rise in open rebellion. He waited. For him, patience was a weapon as sharp as any blade. During Ay's brief reign, Horemheb remained in his post, the silent guardian of Egypt's armies. To the people, Ay's crown carried little weight. It was the general who embodied strength. But Horemheb's restraint defined him. He knew that seizing the throne through the sword would mark him as usurper, a conqueror of his own people. To rule, he needed not just power, but legitimacy. That legitimacy was embodied in Mutnedjmet. She walked the corridors of power with the bearing of one tied to the house of Amarna, yet untainted by its collapse. Her presence beside Horemheb gave his waiting game credibility. If kings fell one by one, if dynasties crumbled, then perhaps Egypt would turn not to bloodlines, but to the man who commanded loyalty of soldiers and bore a queen by his side. Their bond deepened under the weight of expectation. For Mutnedjmet, marriage to Horemheb was both safety and gamble. She had seen Egypt devour kings, Akhenaten, Tutankhamun, Ay, yet she placed her fate in the hands of a soldier. For Horemheb, her companionship was a daily reminder that his rise was not his alone. Together they would carry the burden of Egypt's future. And in the silence of their household, far from the roar of parades or the rituals of temples, they must have known that history was pressing against them, demanding a reckoning. Horemheb's tomb at Saqqara grew as he waited. What had begun as a monument for a general expanded into the scale of royalty, filled with scenes of conquest and order. It was both preparation and declaration. If Egypt would not yet call him king, he would carve himself into eternity as though it already had. Mutnedjmet's image was there as well, etched into stone as his companion in eternity. The message was unmistakable. They were not merely a general and his wife, they were a pharaoh and queen in waiting, their legitimacy carved in anticipation of a crown not yet theirs. Egypt's needs became sharper each year. Corruption spread through the bureaucracy like rot in grain silos. Soldiers complained of unpaid wages. Peasants bore the burden of taxation while officials lined their pockets. The gods, restored in name, had not yet restored balance. In this world of disorder, the people looked not to old courtiers like Ay, but to the commander of armies who could enforce discipline. Yet still Horemheb waited, his patience stretched thin, but never broken. He knew that Egypt's heart longed for restoration, and when the time came, he would be ready. It was Mutnedjmet who gave his patience purpose. Without her, Horemheb would have been a strong man, a general imposing rule through force. With her, he was more. He was the image of legitimacy, the man whose household tied him to dynastic continuity. She was the subtle weight that turned military power into a claim of destiny. In her presence, his ambition became something more than personal. It became national. Thus, in these years, Horemheb's story is not one of open triumph, but of waiting in the shadows, sharpening both his power and his patience. He was the soldier who carried Egypt's survival on his shoulders, while others wore the crown. He was the general who built a tomb as though already king, while the throne remained just out of reach. He was the man whose wife bore the blood of queens, standing beside him in quiet dignity as the court watched with wary eyes. Egypt had entered an age where kings were weak and generals strong, and in the silence of that imbalance, a soldier and a queen waited. They were not yet pharaoh and great royal wife, but already their lives were entwined with Egypt's destiny, The shadows were lengthening, the throne was faltering, and the desert winds whispered that their moment was drawing near. In the shifting balance of dynasties, there are moments when the throne of Egypt feels less like a seat of eternity and more like a fragile stool perched above a storm. After Tutankhamun's fragile youth was extinguished, the aged courtier Ay clutched the crown as if it were a relic he could not release. His reign, brief and brittle, was a twilight interlude between the collapse of one order and the birth of another. Horemheb, the general in command of Egypt's armies, watched from the edges of power, his shadow stretching across the court but never quite stepping into the light. Ay had risen not through charisma, but through cunning. Once a servant in Akhenaten's court, then a manipulator in Tutankhamun's, he seized the throne when opportunity appeared. For a moment, Egypt seemed resigned to an old man's rule, as if survival alone were victory. But his authority was paper-thin. His hands were frail, his health failing, and his legitimacy rooted not in divine lineage, but in desperation. The court knew it, the soldiers knew it, and most importantly, Horemheb knew it. Yet Horemheb did not strike. The man who commanded the might of Egypt's armies, who could have stormed the palace and torn the crown from Ay's wrinkled brow, remained still. His restraint was not weakness. It was calculation. For Horemheb understood that the throne, seized in blood, would never carry the scent of legitimacy. He could become pharaoh only if Egypt itself welcomed him, if his rise felt like restoration rather than rebellion. To wait, to allow the sands of time to strip Ay's rule to dust, was to claim the crown not by force, but by destiny. Mutnedjmet, by his side, embodied the patience of that waiting game. She had grown up in the turbulence of Amarna, seen the gods toppled, the priests humiliated, the palaces abandoned. She understood the fragility of thrones better than anyone. To her, the lesson of Akhenaten and Tutankhamun was clear. Legitimacy could not be forged in haste. It had to be cultivated, ritualized, sanctified. As Ay clung to power, Mutnedjmet's quiet presence at court reminded everyone that her household carried royal blood. The union between her and Horemheb stood like a seed waiting for the flood. Yet waiting was not passive. While Ay wore the crown, Horemheb was building a kingdom of his own, in stone. At Saqqara, his private tomb expanded beyond the scale of any general before him. It began as a monument to a soldier, but year after year its walls stretched outward, its chambers multiplied. Its art shifted from military to royal in tone. Reliefs showed him larger than life, depicted not only as commander of armies, but as restorer of order, lawgiver, patron of temples. The tomb became a rehearsal for kingship, a place where Horemheb practiced eternity before eternity had yet claimed him. And there, in painted scenes and carved reliefs, Mutnedjmet appeared. She was not hidden in shadow, but etched into stone as a partner in destiny. Side by side, they were shown presenting offerings to the gods, their bodies proportioned with the dignity of royal figures. For those who entered the tomb's chambers, the message was unmistakable. Horemheb and Mutnedjmet were more than a general and his wife. They were pharaoh and queen in all but name, awaiting the recognition of time. Ay, meanwhile, shrank before their growing presence. His reign produced no great monuments, no enduring reforms, no heirs to secure his legacy. He ruled, but he did not shape Egypt. The court murmured, the priests of Amun watched, and the army, Horemheb's army, remained loyal to the general who held their pay and their honor in his hands. Ay's throne was not a beacon of eternity, but a flickering lamp in a corridor of shadows. But still Horemheb did not seize it. The years of waiting became a crucible, hardening his discipline into iron. Egypt, he knew, was weary of kings rising and falling like broken reeds. If he struck too soon, he would be remembered not as restorer, but as usurper. If he waited, he could wear the crown not as a conqueror, but as destiny fulfilled. Mutnedjmet, in her quiet resilience, was the embodiment of that legitimacy. She was the royal thread that could bind his rule to Egypt's memory. Without her, he was a soldier. With her, he was pharaoh in waiting. Their household must have been a place of tension, half triumphant, half uncertain. Horemheb could marshal armies, but not fate. Mutnedjmet could carry royal dignity, but not yet the title of great royal wife. They were like actors rehearsing for a drama that had not yet begun, their roles carved in stone, but not yet enacted on the living stage of the court. Outside their walls, Egypt groaned. Corruption spread like a disease. Tax collectors bled villages dry. Officials enriched themselves while peasants starved. Justice was no longer measured by ma'at, the principle of cosmic balance, but by bribes slipped into the hands of judges. Soldiers returning from campaigns found their wages delayed, their loyalty tested. The gods, restored in ritual, still seemed silent in their sanctuaries. The land was hungry for order. It was in this hunger that Horemheb's image grew. His Saqqara tomb was not only a monument, it was propaganda. Visitors saw not just a general but a lawgiver, a man who embodied discipline in an age of chaos. They saw Mutnedjmet, poised beside him, lending her silent blessing to the idea of legitimacy. The tomb became a stage on which their future was already being rehearsed. Ay's health waned. His courtiers plotted. His authority thinned to the point of invisibility. And through it all, Horemheb waited. Between thrones and tombs, between patience and ambition, between the fragility of an old man's rule and the promise of a general's destiny, Egypt held its breath. Mutnedjmet's role in this chapter of waiting cannot be overstated. She was not the loud voice in council, nor the hand that wielded the sword. She was the seal of legitimacy, the quiet presence that turned Horemheb's ambition into destiny. Without her, he might have seized the throne in violence and been remembered as a usurper. With her, he could wait, endure, and step into power as if chosen by the gods. This was the paradox of their union. In a land built on monuments, their power in these years was invisible, intangible, whispered. But whispers can outlast shouts, and patience can outlive desperation. Thus the story of Horemheb and Mutnedjmet in these years is not one of action, but of anticipation, not of conquest, but of waiting. Their tomb at Saqqara grew like a prophecy. Their presence at court loomed like a shadow. And as Ay's grip loosened on the throne, the soldier and the queen in waiting stood ready, between thrones and tombs, preparing to step into history. Egypt was not yet theirs, but the desert winds already carried their names. The army murmured of their general. The court whispered of their queen. The gods, silent but watching, seemed to hold their breath. The moment was approaching when patience would end, when shadows would give way to light, and when Horemheb and Mutnedjmet would no longer need to wait. The throne of Egypt has never been a gentle inheritance. It is a seat carved not only from golden stone, but from blood, ambition, and the fragile weight of legitimacy. When the aged Ay finally surrendered his life to time, the double crown lay vulnerable, suspended between memory and destiny. For the first time in a generation, the throne was unguarded by heirs. Egypt held its breath, waiting to see who would dare to claim it. Out of the shadows stepped Horemheb, a man forged by discipline, hardened by campaigns and sharpened by years of waiting, and beside him stood Mutnedjmet, the woman whose very blood turned ambition into something more than conquest. Ay's death was less an ending than a release. His reign had been short, his authority brittle. With his passing, the illusion of continuity collapsed, and the court was thrown into disarray. There was no son to inherit, no child king to be manipulated, no widow to be remarried into power. For once, the palace corridors fell silent with uncertainty. It was in that silence that Horemheb's footsteps echoed loudest. He commanded the army, the very spine of Egypt. He commanded loyalty where kings had commanded only fear. And now, with Mutnedjmet's lineage binding him to the dynastic fabric, he could step forward not as usurper, but as pharaoh. The coronation that followed was less ceremony than revelation. The temples of Thebes trembled with the return of order. The priests of Amun raised their voices, not in protest but in acceptance, for Horemheb promised them restoration. Soldiers lined the avenues, their discipline reflecting the man who had commanded them for decades. And at the heart of it all stood Horemheb himself, his head bowed beneath the double crown, the living image of a soldier transformed into king. The man who had once been painted on tomb walls as commander now stood in flesh as pharaoh. But he was not alone. Mutnedjmet, once the quiet partner in waiting, now walked beside him as great royal wife. Her presence was more than symbolic. For courtiers and priests, she represented continuity with dynasties past, a woman tied by blood to the Amarna family, her identity weaving legitimacy into her husband's rule. Together they were the image of restoration, a soldier who embodied discipline and a queen who embodied lineage. Their union was the bridge Egypt had longed for, the anchor in an age of chaos. The people of Egypt, weary of corruption and weary of fragility, greeted their new sovereigns with a mixture of relief and awe. Theirs was not a boy king destined to die young, nor an old courtier clinging to power. Theirs was a ruler who had proven himself in battlefields, who had carried Egypt's armies through storms, who now brought the weight of law to the throne. Mutnedjmet, appearing beside him at rituals, reminded all who watched that his reign was not merely ambition, it was sanctioned by the silent thread of dynasty. Yet coronations, for all their splendor, are never without shadows. To claim the throne, Horemheb began the great work of erasure. The names of Ay were chiseled out from monuments. Reliefs bearing the memory of Tutankhamun and even earlier Amarna figures were overwritten with his own. Where once another man's cartouche had stood, now stood Horemheb's. It was not merely vanity, it was necessity. For in Egypt, memory was power. To rule, he had to control the past as much as the present, and so he erased, rewrote, and inscribed himself into the lineage he had never been born into. Mutnedjmet's role in this erasure was both visible and invisible. She participated in ceremonies that restored Amun's temples, offering incense, standing beside her husband as order was proclaimed. Yet her very identity, a possible sister or kin to Nefertiti, meant that she embodied the paradox of the restoration. She was at once connected to the family that had nearly destroyed Egypt and the woman who legitimized the man restoring it. In her, continuity and contradiction fused. The crown on her husband's head gleamed brighter because of her presence. Yet the shadow of Amarna still whispered through her veins. The imagery of their reign in these early years was one of triumph. Reliefs showed Horemheb as conqueror, as lawgiver, as the chosen of the gods. Mutnedjmet appeared at his side, dignified, graceful, embodying the divine feminine that anchored kingship. To the priests, she was the vessel through which old wounds were healed. To the court, she was the seal that turned a soldier into Pharaoh. To the people, she was the queen who walked with a king of discipline, embodying the promise that Egypt had at last found stability. Yet beneath the splendor lay fragility. Horemheb had claimed the throne, but the question of succession still haunted them. He and Mutnedjmet had no living children to secure the line. The throne, for all its grandeur, remained vulnerable. And so his rule became not only about restoration, but about endurance, about building a kingdom strong enough to survive even if his own bloodline ended with him. In this paradox, their reign took shape. The crown was seized not by violence, but by patience. The queen's blood legitimized the general's ambition. Together they embodied both rupture and restoration, both memory and erasure. Egypt, long fractured, felt for the first time in decades the weight of stability. But it was a stability built on fragile foundations, a throne seized from shadows, a dynasty without heirs. The coronation of Horemheb and Mutnedjmet was more than a moment. It was a transformation. Egypt had turned from chaos to order, from uncertainty to discipline. But in the gleaming light of that triumph, a shadow lingered. The knowledge that every crown is borrowed, that every dynasty depends not only on strength, but on continuity. And in that shadow lay the seeds of both greatness and tragedy. Power once seized must be defended not only with armies, but with laws. For Egypt had been hollowed by decades of corruption, by scribes who took bribes, by officials who twisted justice, by soldiers who abused their stations. The throne of Horemheb, newly seized and gleaming with legitimacy, could not rest on ceremony alone. It needed discipline as ironclad as the man who wore the crown. And so Horemheb, the soldier who had risen to kingship, turned his attention not only to temples and armies, but to the very fabric of Egypt's society. What emerged was one of the most fearsome proclamations in the history of the Nile, the Great Edict of Horemheb. The edict was carved into stone at Karnak, not hidden in scrolls or whispered in courts, but displayed in monumental scale for all to see. It was a declaration of war, not against foreign enemies, but against the rot within Egypt itself. Horemheb had seen with his own eyes how the machinery of empire faltered. Tax collectors who stole from peasants while demanding tribute, judges who weighed gold heavier than truth, soldiers who plundered the weak instead of defending them. These were cancers that hollowed Egypt's strength from the inside. And so he wielded law as another weapon, as sharp as any sword, to cut corruption from the body of the state. The punishments he decreed were brutal, designed to terrify. Officials who accepted bribes faced mutilation, their noses cut from their faces, their shame etched forever on their bodies. Soldiers who extorted peasants could be beaten with rods until blood soaked the earth. Judges who perverted justice could be exiled to the far frontier of Tharu, stripped of honor and cast out from the heart of Egypt. Even death was prescribed for those whose crimes corroded the balance of Maat. These measures were not subtle. They were spectacles of fear meant to shock the bureaucracy into obedience. To a modern mind, these punishments may seem savage, but to Horemheb, they were medicine. Egypt's sickness was not weakness of armies or barrenness of fields. It was corruption, the quiet theft that bled the people dry and eroded faith in kingship. By punishing harshly, he sought to make an example of the few so the many might tremble into honesty. Justice in his reign was not gentle balance, but stern restoration. The law was a battlefield, and he fought it as he had fought campaigns in Nubia and Syria, with discipline and ruthlessness. Mutnedjmet, standing beside him, became the silent counterpoint to this ferocity. As great royal wife, she appeared in ceremonies, her figure carved into reliefs as the embodiment of continuity and divine femininity. Where Horemheb wielded terror, she radiated dignity. Together, their imagery projected a message. The king would enforce order with iron, but the queen would sanctify it with legitimacy. She was the soft face that offset his hard edge, the reminder that Egypt was not only ruled by fear, but also by tradition, by lineage, by the grace of a queen descended from royal blood. The people of Egypt received the edict with a mixture of awe and dread. For the peasants who had long suffered the greed of officials, it was a beacon of hope. At last, a pharaoh was punishing the powerful instead of crushing the weak. But for the scribes, judges, and bureaucrats, it was a reign of terror. Every bribe taken, every false judgment given, carried the risk of mutilation or exile. The court became a place of caution, where whispers fell silent, where fear replaced intrigue. Egypt was being reshaped not through conquest abroad, but through discipline at home. The edict did more than punish. It restored faith. Soldiers knew their wages would be safeguarded. Peasants believed their grain would no longer be stolen before it reached the granaries. Priests of Amun, grateful for the king's restoration of their temples, now saw his laws as divine instruments of Ma'at. For the first time in years, Egypt felt as though order was being rebuilt from the ground up. Horemheb, once the general who commanded soldiers, had become the pharaoh who commanded the conscience of the state. Yet beneath this triumph lay shadows of fragility. The punishments were harsh because the sickness was deep. Fear can enforce obedience, but it cannot breed loyalty. Egypt was stable, yes, but it was a stability built on discipline, not devotion. Mutnedjmet's presence helped soften the image, reminding Egypt that the throne still bore the grace of a queen, but her influence could not erase the truth. Horemheb's Egypt was held together by the iron fist of law. For Horemheb himself, the edict was not only politics but identity. He was not a king by blood. He could not claim descent from the great line of Thutmoses or Amenhoteps. What he could claim was discipline, the law, the restoration of Ma'at. His legitimacy rested not in ancestry, but in action. Not in divine birth, but in the ruthless enforcement of justice. Mutnedjmet gave him a thread to dynastic continuity, but his edict gave him a throne built on fear and respect. The Karnak inscription was more than words. It was a monument to his reign, carved in stone as eternal as the pillars of the temple. Long after Horemheb's body would lie in his valley of the king's tomb, long after Mutnedjmet's burial in Saqqara, the edict would remain as the voice of a soldier king who forged legitimacy through law. It was his declaration to history that he, who had not been born pharaoh, had restored Pharaoh's authority through justice uncompromising and merciless. In this moment, the paradox of their reign grew sharper. Horemheb was feared, his laws biting into the marrow of the state. Mutnedjmet was revered, her lineage offering continuity with a past Egypt longed to preserve. Together they embodied balance, iron and silk, terror and dignity, fear and grace. Egypt, weary of chaos, accepted the harshness as the price of order. And for a time, the Nile flowed under a kingdom disciplined, restored, but also haunted by the knowledge that fear is a fragile foundation. Thus, in the middle years of Horemheb's reign, the story of the general-turned-king and the queen who legitimized him reached its most formidable chapter. Egypt was disciplined into obedience. Corruption was punished with mutilation and exile. The throne gleamed with restored power. And yet, beneath it all, the dynasty remained hollow, for no heir had yet been born to carry their work into the next generation. The crown was secure, but the future was uncertain. And as the gods watched, Horemheb and Mutnedjmet ruled in Egypt both awed and afraid, an Egypt bound by the edict of fear and justice. The Nile has always been more than a river. It is the pulse of Egypt's spirit, carrying not just water and silt, but faith, memory, and eternity. In the years after the Great Edict of Horemheb, when corruption had been beaten back with rod and knife, the pharaoh turned his gaze to the temples, the true heart of the kingdom, where gods were not only worshipped, but enthroned as guarantors of kingship. If law restored discipline, then temples would restore faith. And in this chapter of his reign, Horemheb set about remaking Egypt's sacred landscape, while Mutnedjmet stood beside him as queen, the living emblem of continuity, participating in rites that erased chaos and resurrected order. The shadow of Amarna still lingered. Akhenaten's revolution had not only insulted the priests of Amun, but had scarred the very architecture of faith. Temples to Aten rose briefly in a blaze of innovation, only to fall into ruin when the heretics' vision collapsed. Their talatat blocks, small and uniform, lay scattered like broken dice across the sands. Horemheb, pragmatic as ever, ordered them dismantled, repurposed, hidden within the walls of new pylons at Karnak. What had once been symbols of a sun cult now became invisible bones in the architecture of restored tradition. The irony was sharp. Akhenaten's dream was literally entombed within the stone skeletons of Amun's house. At Karnak, Horemheb's mark grew monumental. He commissioned pylons, gates, and courtyards that reasserted the supremacy of Amun, the god whose silence during Amarna had been interpreted not as weakness, but as patience. Each stone, each relief carved with the king's name, was not merely architecture, but propaganda. It said, Egypt is whole again. Egypt has returned to its gods. Egypt has found in Horemheb a restorer of Ma'at, the great hypostyle hall, that forest of columns rising like papyrus stalks toward the heavens, began in his reign. Later dynasties would finish it, but its foundation was his vision, the vision of a soldier who became a builder, a man who erased in order to restore. Mutnedjmet's role in this restoration was more than ornamental. She appeared in rituals, her body draped in the regalia of queenship, presenting offerings, standing beside Horemheb as he symbolically fed the gods with incense, wine, and bread. Reliefs show her at his side, embodying the female principle without which kingship was incomplete. For Egypt, a king was never enough. Pharaoh was divine in himself, but balance required a queen, the great royal wife, who represented the counterpart of cosmic order. Mutnedjmet's presence sanctified his rebuilding. Without her, Horemheb was a general-turned-pharaoh. With her, he was part of the eternal duet of male and female power that upheld the world. The politics of memory were inscribed into every stone. Tutankhamun's name was erased, Ay's cartouches carved over, and in their place appeared Horemheb's. To modern eyes, this seems theft, but in ancient Egypt, it was survival. By inscribing his name where others had stood, Horemheb did not simply claim their deeds, he consumed their memory, ensuring that eternity would forget them and remember him. Mutnedjmet, though less visible in these usurpations, was the silent accomplice. for her very lineage connected the past to the present. In her veins, memory flowed. In his hands, memory was rewritten. Together they reshaped Egypt's story not only for their own reign, but for eternity. The common people experienced this restoration not through inscriptions, but through ritual. Festivals of Amun returned with full splendor. Processions wound through Thebes, statues of gods borne on gilded barks. Incense thick in the air, hymns rising to the sky. Where once Aten's solitary sun had burned in lonely isolation, now the multiplicity of gods returned in pageantry. Mutnedjmet appeared before the people, her image radiating continuity, her presence reassuring them that Egypt was once again in harmony with its divine order. For the peasants, it was a sign that the cosmic balance had been restored. For the priests, it was vindication. For the throne, it was legitimacy incarnate, yet the restoration carried a hidden cruelty. In destroying the monuments of Amarna, in burying its memory, Horemheb was not only rebuilding, he was erasing. The revolution of Akhenaten, with all its audacity and vision, was condemned to oblivion. Its temples became fill for pylons, its names chiseled into dust, its images mutilated beyond recognition. Even Tutankhamun, once cherished by the people, was sacrificed on the altar of this restoration. His monuments were usurped, his name effaced, his reign folded into the shadow of Horemheb's. It was not only a return to tradition, but a rewriting of truth. The pharaoh who had restored order did so by declaring that only his order had ever existed. Mutnedjmet's paradox deepened in this act of erasure. If she was truly the sister of Nefertiti, her role in this restoration is steeped in irony. She, whose family had once raised Aten above all gods, now stood beside the king who buried that memory beneath blocks of stone. Her silence in the reliefs, her dignity in rituals, masked what must have been an inner tension. A woman tied by blood to the most radical revolution in Egyptian history, now serving as queen in the reign that obliterated it. The public saw only her legitimacy. History leaves us only her image carved beside her husband. But behind that stone mask, there must have been complexity, perhaps even sorrow. Still, Egypt prospered. The Nile continued its cycles, temples grew, priests rejoiced, soldiers found stability and a state restored. Horemheb was not a conqueror in these years. He did not launch grand campaigns into Syria or Nubia. His conquest was internal: temples, laws, memory. His battlefield was Egypt itself, and in that battle, he emerged victorious. Mutnedjmet, though less visible in the chronicles, was his indispensable partner, sanctifying each act with her presence, weaving legitimacy into every ritual. As the pylons of Karnak rose, as the blocks of Amarna disappeared into foundations, Egypt entered a new era of solidity. The soldier had become the builder. The queen had become the bridge between past and present. And together they offered Egypt not the thrill of conquest, but the reassurance of stability. Yet beneath the stone, the fragility remained. For though temples could be rebuilt, though names could be erased, one truth remained unaltered. Horemheb and Mutnedjmet had no heir. The dynasty was a palace built without foundations, a structure magnificent but hollow. Each block placed at Karnak was a monument not only to restoration, but to the unspoken question of what would come after. In these years of temple building, Egypt looked eternal again. The statues were polished, the gods honored, the festivals restored. But eternity is a fragile illusion when bloodlines run dry. And in the shadows of Karnak, as incense rose and hymns echoed, the silence of succession lingered like an unspoken curse. A pharaoh may command armies and reshape temples, but the endurance of a dynasty rests not in stone or law, but in flesh and blood. For Horemheb, the soldier who became pharaoh, the silence of his household was louder than the hymns of Karnak. He had seized the crown with legitimacy forged through Mutnedjmet, the queen who carried dynastic blood into his reign. But as years passed, no son emerged to secure the throne, no daughter to bind their memory to Egypt's future. Their reign, for all its discipline and grandeur, teetered on the edge of extinction. It was a paradox both intimate and political, a tragedy that unfolded in the private chambers of the palace, but echoed across the empire. Mutnedjmet bore the burden of expectation. To be great royal wife was not only to stand in rituals, to offer incense, to appear carved into stone as a symbol of balance. It was to provide continuity. Queens of Egypt carried dynasties in their wombs. The promise of stability, the endurance of Ma'at, depended on their ability to produce heirs. For Mutnedjmet, whose very lineage connected Horemheb to royal blood, the expectation was doubled. Her body was not only her own, it was the vessel of legitimacy. Each month that passed without a child was not merely personal sorrow, but political anxiety. The sources are sparse, but archaeology whispers a story both tender and tragic. Evidence suggests that Mutnedjmet may have died in childbirth, perhaps attempting to give Horemheb the heir he so desperately needed. In her burial at Saqqara, her remains have been interpreted by some scholars as those of a woman who perished while delivering life. If so, the irony is cruel. The queen whose very presence sanctified Horemheb's rule gave her life in the attempt to secure its future. The womb that legitimized the throne became the tomb that ended hope of continuity. Imagine the palace in those days. Horemheb, the iron general who had crushed corruption and restored temples, now faced a battle he could not win. His soldiers could enforce law, but they could not summon an heir. His edicts could terrify officials, but they could not bend the will of the gods. Mutnedjmet, regal and serene in public, may have wept in private as each attempt to produce an heir ended in silence or sorrow. The weight of expectation pressed upon her shoulders, not only as a wife, but as a queen. Every prayer to Hathor, every offering to Taweret, the goddess of childbirth, carried with it the desperation of a dynasty teetering on the edge. And when death came, whether in childbirth or in some other silent tragedy, it was more than a personal loss. It was a fracture in the very structure of Horemheb's reign. Without Mutnedjmet, his link to dynastic continuity weakened. Without her, his household became hollow, a palace without the queen who had sanctified it. For the king who had waited patiently, who had built his power on her legitimacy, her absence was more devastating than any defeat in battle. Her tomb at Saqqara reflects the poignancy of her role. Unlike the Valley of the Kings, where pharaohs carved eternity in deep rock, Saqqara carried the intimacy of personal burials, close to Memphis, where scribes and officials had once lived. There, Mutnedjmet was laid to rest, surrounded by the echoes of her husband's earlier life as a general. She was not interred in KV 57, the grand royal tomb that Horemheb would one day occupy, but in the place that connected them to their rise, to the years before the throne. It was as though her story ended where his began, a reminder that their destinies were forever entwined, even in death. For Horemheb, the loss must have been crushing. The general who had disciplined armies, the pharaoh who had disciplined a nation, could not discipline grief. Mutnedjmet had been more than a wife. She had been his bridge to kingship, his partner in legitimacy, his counterbalance in ritual. Without her, he stood alone in the palace, a soldier king whose laws were iron, but whose household was empty. In the reliefs, her carved presence endured, but in life, her voice was silent. This absence echoed in Egypt's politics. The priests of Amun continued their rituals, the pylons of Karnak rose, the edicts of law still terrified officials. Outwardly, Egypt was strong, stable, restored. But beneath the surface, the dynasty was hollow. Every courtier knew it, every soldier understood it. The people who once prayed for stability now whispered of uncertainty. What would happen when Horemheb, already aging, passed into the afterlife? Who would inherit the throne? Without Mutnedjmet, the answer was unclear. In this paradox, Horemheb's reign took on a new dimension. He was no longer simply the restorer of order. He became the pharaoh preparing for the inevitable void. His decisions in the coming years, particularly in naming a successor outside his own bloodline, were shaped by the absence of Mutnedjmet and the child she could never give him. Her death was not only a personal tragedy, it redirected the course of Egypt's history. The Ramesses I dynasty, with all its splendor and power, rose not from Horemheb's heirs, but from his choice to pass the throne to his vizier, Paramessu. That choice was born of necessity, and that necessity was born of loss. And so the story of Mutnedjmet is one of paradox. She was the queen who legitimized a general's rise, the woman whose presence sanctified the restoration of temples, the silent partner who gave dignity to a reign built on discipline. Yet she was also the queen whose absence revealed the fragility of that reign, the woman whose failure to provide an heir determined the course of dynastic succession. Her life gave Horemheb legitimacy. Her death left him heirless. In her, Egypt's fate was both secured and broken. For the audience of history, her memory lingers in fragments, bones in a Saqqara tomb, reliefs beside her husband, whispers of kinship to Nefertiti. But for Horemheb, her memory was no fragment. It was the central thread of his life, the queen whose presence defined his kingship and whose absence defined its end. In the silent corridors of Karnak, where incense still rose, and in the painted chambers of tombs where eternity was rehearsed, Mutnedjmet's absence was felt as keenly as her presence had once been displayed. Egypt was restored, but the dynasty was broken. The queen's burden had been too great, and in carrying it, she had given her life. There is a difference between seizing power and holding it. In his early years as pharaoh, Horemheb had proven himself a restorer of temples, of justice, of discipline. But the true test of any reign comes not in the first triumphs, but in the long shadows of age, when victories fade into memory and the question becomes not what has been built, but what will endure. By the time Mutnedjmet was gone, Egypt stood visibly stronger, its temples renewed, its bureaucracy disciplined. Yet for Horemheb, the absence of his queen carved a hollow space at the heart of his kingship. He had the crown, but he no longer had the partner who had legitimized it. Alone, the soldier king entered the final act of his reign. Horemheb's Egypt in these years was not a land of great conquest, but of guarded stability. Unlike the warrior kings of earlier dynasties, he launched no spectacular campaigns into Syria or Nubia. His military energy had been spent in the decades before his coronation, when he fought under Tutankhamun. As pharaoh, he understood that Egypt needed not expansion, but consolidation. The Great Edict had curbed corruption, the temples of Amun rose again, and the image of Pharaoh as guardian of Ma'at was reasserted. His rule became less about the thrill of conquest and more about the steady weight of guardianship. He was the soldier on the throne, watchful, disciplined, pragmatic, unyielding, but the loneliness of his position grew heavier with each passing year. Mutnedjmet's death left him without an heir, and without her presence in ritual, his reign seemed marked by absence. Relief still showed her carved into stone, frozen in eternal dignity, yet in life the throne room stood emptier. Horemheb, who had once shared the burden of legitimacy with his queen, now carried it alone. To the people, his authority remained unquestioned, but within the walls of the palace he must have felt the weight of solitude pressing like the desert sun. The building of his tomb in the Valley of the Kings reflected this duality of strength and fragility. KV 57, carved deep into the Theban cliffs, marked a departure from the grand but unfinished Saqqara tomb he had begun as a general. By choosing to be buried among pharaohs, he inscribed himself fully into the line of kings, abandoning the memorial he had once planned for himself as an outsider. The tomb's architecture spoke of transition. Its axis shifted toward the straight lines that would characterize later Ramesses I burials, abandoning the dog-leg turns of earlier dynasties. It was as though Horemheb was consciously bridging eras, his tomb standing as the threshold between the 18th dynasty and the 19th. Inside, the decoration carried innovations that echoed his role as restorer and reformer. On its walls appeared the Book of Gates, a funerary text that described the passage of the sun god through 12 gates of the night, each guarded by fearsome deities, each demanding the recognition of secret names. It was the first time this text appeared in a royal tomb. The imagery was stark and new. The king identified with the sun god, moving through darkness toward rebirth. For Horemheb, whose reign had been about guiding Egypt from chaos into order, the symbolism was poignant. He was the pharaoh who restored Ma'at in life, and now in death he sought to pass through the cosmic gates of judgment to eternal stability. Yet the work on KV 57 was hurried. Its walls bear sketches, left unfinished, outlines of figures never fully carved, scenes painted, but not completed. The tomb feels interrupted, as though death came before the artisans could finish their labor. It is a reminder that even a pharaoh cannot command time. The soldier who had built his reign on patience was betrayed at the last by mortality itself. Beyond the tomb, his reign continued its quiet stability. There were no dramatic battles to etch into stele, no grand campaigns to trumpet across foreign lands. Instead, there was administration, the steady maintenance of what had been rebuilt. The temples thrived, the bureaucracy functioned. Corruption, though never eradicated, was checked by fear of his edicts. Egypt breathed in stability, but it was the stability of an old soldier standing guard, not of a dynasty flowering with heirs. The question of succession grew sharper with each year. Without Mutnedjmet, Horemheb had no child to inherit the throne. For a pharaoh, this was more than personal tragedy. It was a rupture in cosmic order. Kingship was not meant to end. It was meant to flow, like the Nile, unbroken from one generation to the next. To leave Egypt without an heir was to threaten chaos once more. And so Horemheb, pragmatic as always, made a soldier's decision. He would not pretend. He would not gamble on miracles. Instead, he chose a successor, not from his blood, but from his ranks. His vizier Paramessu, a man of military and administrative discipline, was appointed heir. When Horemheb died, Paramessu would ascend as Ramesses I, founding the 19th dynasty. This choice was both foresight and resignation. Foresight, because it ensured continuity, preventing another scramble for the throne that might fracture the state. Resignation, because it admitted that Horemheb's line ended with him, that the dynasty he had seized and legitimized could not be carried forward by his own children. In this, the absence of Mutnedjmet was felt once more. For had she lived, had she borne him a son, Egypt's history might have been written differently. Instead, the soldier prepared not only his tomb, but the succession of others. In his final years, Horemheb must have reflected on the paradox of his reign. He had restored order, but erased memory. He had rebuilt temples, but left no heir to worship in them. He had ruled with discipline, but at the cost of fear. He had seized the crown through patience and legitimacy, but his name would forever stand as the last of his dynasty, the bridge into another. The loneliness of these years was not only personal, but dynastic. His was the reign of restoration without continuation, triumph without inheritance. And yet for Egypt, his reign mattered profoundly. He was the man who took a fractured kingdom and gave it back its balance. He was the pharaoh who taught that kingship was not only birth, but discipline, not only blood, but law. His tomb, though unfinished, was the gateway into a new age. His choice of Paramessu, ensuring that Egypt would not fall into chaos at his death. The soldier on the throne had carried his watch to the end. Alone, without Mutnedjmet, without heirs, he stood as pharaoh until the gods themselves called him into the night. And in the silence of KV 57, amid sketches left incomplete, one can still feel the presence of a man who lived not for glory, but for order, not for conquest, but for stability. His reign was a bridge, and like all bridges, it was destined to be crossed by others. In this way, the final years of Horemheb were both quiet and monumental. They were quiet in the absence of battles and heirs, but monumental in the stability he left behind. He was the soldier who had waited in shadows, seized the crown, restored the gods, disciplined the state, and prepared Egypt for the dynasty to come. And in the shadows of his tomb, where unfinished carvings whisper of mortality, the story of the soldier on the throne finds its poignant close. There are moments in history when a single decision shapes centuries to come. For Horemheb, that moment arrived not on the battlefield, nor in the courts of Thebes, but in the quiet reckoning of his final years. He had seized the crown from shadows, restored order from chaos, and rebuilt temples from ruins. Yet one truth haunted him more than any campaign or reform. He would leave no son, no daughter, no living heir of his own blood. His reign, monumental as it was, would end with him. The question that loomed above all others was not what had been restored, but what would endure once he was gone. Egypt could not be left to chance. The gods demanded continuity. The people demanded stability. A throne left vacant was an invitation to chaos, a wound that could reopen the fractures of Amarna. Horemheb, soldier that he was, could not allow the order he had fought to restore to collapse at the edge of his grave. And so, with the same discipline that had marked his life, he turned to the matter of succession. He would not leave Egypt heirless. He would choose a dynasty, even if it was not his own. The man he chose was Paramessu, his trusted vizier, a figure of both military and administrative strength. Paramessu was no child of divine descent, no scion of the old dynasties, but like Horemheb himself, he was a man forged in service. In him, Horemheb saw both reflection and continuation, another soldier administrator who could carry forward the discipline, pragmatism, and stability that defined his reign. When Horemheb's body failed, it would be Paramessu who rose, not as vizier, but as Pharaoh Ramesses, founder of the 19th dynasty. This choice was both radical and practical. Radical because Horemheb admitted openly that his line was finished, that the divine thread of kingship did not pass through his blood. Practical because he ensured Egypt would not stumble into civil war over the empty throne. It was the act of a soldier who valued order above pride, discipline above vanity. By naming Paramessu, he secured continuity, not of his own family, but of Egypt itself. Yet this act carried irony. Horemheb, who had seized the throne by waiting, who had legitimized his rule through Mutnedjmet, who had carved his name over Tutankhamun and Ay, would be remembered not as the founder of a dynasty, but as its end. He was the last pharaoh of the 18th dynasty, a dynasty that had seen both glory and collapse, expansion and heresy, splendor and ruin. In him it ended, and from his decision, a new dynasty began, one that would dominate Egypt for over a century, producing giants like Seti I and Ramesses II. Mutnedjmet's absence haunted this decision. Had she lived, had she given him a son, the course of history might have been different. The line of Horemheb might have continued, a dynasty born of soldier and queen, of discipline and legitimacy. Instead, her silence left him no choice but to adopt another's line. In this way, her death shaped Egypt as surely as her life had legitimized Horemheb's rise. She had been the beginning of his reign. Her absence was the reason it ended without heirs. The court must have watched this decision with mixed emotions. Some may have seen weakness, that a pharaoh could not perpetuate his own bloodline. Others saw wisdom, that he placed Egypt's stability above his pride. The priests of Amun, who had been restored under his reign, accepted it, for continuity mattered more than ancestry. The army, ever loyal to discipline, supported it, for Paramessu was one of their own. For the people, it mattered little whose name was carved in cartouches, so long as the Nile flowed and the temple stood. Horemheb's reign, in its closing act, became defined by this paradox. He was the pharaoh who ended a dynasty, yet ensured Egypt's survival. He erased names to inscribe his own, yet at the end, he prepared to pass his crown to another's name. He restored memory by erasing memory, and in the end, his own memory became that of a bridge, not a foundation. The irony deepens when one looks at his tomb. KV 57, unfinished, its walls sketched but incomplete, seems to echo the incompleteness of his dynasty. He had built monuments at Karnak, he had raised pylons, he had carved his name across Egypt, but in death his house of eternity stood half-finished, a mirror of a reign that restored order, but could not perpetuate itself. The Book of Gates, painted along its walls, tells of the sun, God's passage through night toward rebirth. For Horemheb, the passage was personal. He had guided Egypt through its night, restored its dawn, but his own line would not be reborn. Instead, another would inherit the sunrise. And yet, to measure Horemheb only by his lack of heirs is to misunderstand his legacy. Egypt did not collapse with his death. It flourished, carried forward by the dynasty he had chosen. His reign was not the flowering of a line, but the laying of foundations. Without him, the Ramesside age, the golden era of Seti and Ramesses, might never have emerged with such strength. He was the man who ensured Egypt would step into that future without stumbling into chaos. Thus, the choice of Paramessu was not failure, but sacrifice. It was the ultimate act of a soldier king, to surrender the dream of personal legacy for the survival of the state. In that act, Horemheb became more than pharaoh. He became guardian of Egypt itself. He had lived as a man of discipline, ruled as a king of restoration, and died as the last of his line. But he ensured that Egypt would endure. And so history remembers him with paradox. He is the pharaoh who erased others' names, yet whose own reign prepared for another's glory. He is the last of one dynasty and the father, in choice, if not in blood, of the next. He is both ending and beginning, silence and continuity. Mutnedjmet's blood gave him legitimacy, her absence left him heirless, and his choice gave Egypt a dynasty that would shine across centuries. The soldier who had once waited in shadows ended his reign not with conquest, not with heirs, but with a decision. And in that decision lay Egypt's future. Every reign, no matter how strong, bends eventually before the weight of time. Horemheb had lived long enough to see Egypt restored, its temples rebuilt, its gods honored, its officials disciplined, its throne secured. He had survived the collapse of Amarna, outlasted the brief reigns of Tutankhamun and Ay, and ruled long enough to be remembered as the final guardian of the 18th dynasty. Yet in his final days, as age withered the body that had once marched across deserts and commanded armies, even Horemheb could not escape the fate of all pharaohs. The man who had rebuilt Egypt prepared to enter eternity. The Valley of the Kings awaited him. Deep in the cliffs of Thebes, artisans carved the winding corridors of KV 57, his eternal house. The tomb was ambitious, a departure from the older traditions, signaling transition toward the style of the coming Ramesses age. Its passages ran straight, its chambers expanding, like the path of the sun god into night. On its walls, artists painted scenes of the Book of Gates, the new funerary text that spoke of the sun's perilous journey through 12 gates of darkness before rebirth at dawn. For the first time in history, this vision adorned a royal tomb. It was fitting. Horemheb, who had guided Egypt through the darkness of chaos, was now inscribed into the very imagery of cosmic rebirth. But even the tomb carried the marks of mortality. Its walls, though painted with care, remained unfinished. Figures stood in outline, details uncarved, spaces left bare. Death had come before the artisans could complete their labor. The soldier king, who had built monuments across Egypt, would rest in a house of eternity, still half-carved, its incompleteness a symbol of his reign. Restoration without heirs, stability without continuation. Mutnedjmet was not there beside him. She had been laid to rest years earlier at Saqqara, far from the cliffs of Thebes, her death a wound that had reshaped his destiny. In life, she had legitimized his throne. In death, her absence had forced him to seek a successor beyond his blood. The queen whose presence sanctified his reign and whose womb might have carried its future now lay in another tomb, a reminder that even pharaohs cannot command love or lineage. For Horemheb, eternity began not with companionship, but with solitude. Yet in that solitude lay paradoxical triumph. Though he died without heirs, he left Egypt stronger than he had found it. The temples of Amun rose again, their pylons gleaming in the sun. The priesthood thrived, their rituals renewed. The army, disciplined under his command, remained the spine of the kingdom. The people, weary of the chaos of Amarna, now lived under the stability of restored Maat. And though his own bloodline ended, his choice of Paramessu as successor ensured that Egypt would not crumble into civil war. From that choice rose the 19th dynasty, a line that would give Egypt some of its greatest rulers. Seti, Ramesses I, the kings whose names would echo across centuries. Thus, Horemheb became both ending and beginning. The last pharaoh of the 18th dynasty, and in a sense, the father of the Ramesside age. His reign was the bridge across which Egypt crossed from chaos to order, from collapse to revival. He was remembered not as conqueror, but as restorer, not as founder, but as finisher, not as father of heirs, but as guardian of continuity. The paradox of his life lingers like incense in a closed chamber. He seized the crown, yet claimed to restore. He erased names to inscribe his own, yet passed his throne to another's line. He was legitimized by Mutnedjmet, yet left heirless because of her loss. He rebuilt Egypt for eternity, yet his own tomb stands unfinished. He lived as a soldier, ruled as a pharaoh, and died as both the last and the first. Last of one dynasty, first to ensure the next. In the silence of KV 57, where torches once flickered on unpainted walls, one can still imagine the funeral procession that carried him to rest. Priests chanted hymns, incense filled the chambers, soldiers saluted the body of their general turned king. In the distance, the Nile flowed as it always had, indifferent yet eternal. The sun descended into night as it always had, and the king joined its journey, passing through the gates toward rebirth. And yet history remembers not the tears shed at his burial, nor the unfinished carvings of his tomb, but the paradox of his legacy. Horemheb is the pharaoh who ended a dynasty by preserving Egypt, who ruled without heirs yet ensured continuity, who restored the gods by erasing their rivals, who left silence where others expected lineage. He is remembered not for what he passed on in blood, but for what he preserved in order. Mutnedjmet's shadow lingers here too. Without her, he could never have risen. With her, he legitimized his reign. Without her, he left no heir. With her absence, he chose a dynasty that would define Egypt's future. She too was both presence and absence, both foundation and fracture, both queen and lost mother of a line that never was. Their story, entwined in paradox, became the hinge upon which Egypt turned. And so, the tale ends not in triumph or tragedy alone, but in a haunting, cinematic stillness. A soldier sits alone on a throne of stone, his queen's presence etched into memory but absent in eternity, his name carved over others, yet his dynasty ended, his tomb unfinished, yet his order preserved. Egypt survived him. Egypt flourished after him. But Horemheb himself became a question etched into history. Is it better to be remembered as the founder of a dynasty or as the guardian who ended one so another could rise? In that silence, in that paradox, lies the legacy of Horemheb. His story closes not with a conquest, nor with an heir's coronation, but with a profound truth, that sometimes the most enduring rulers are not those who pass their blood to the future, but those who sacrifice their pride to secure it for others. And in that sacrifice, Horemheb's reign, born in shadows, crowned in discipline, and ended in solitude, becomes eternal.